The governor, Mark Dayton, based on his submissions to the court, thinks that he and his commissioner of deed, Katie Sieben, substituted for Mark Phillips, have virtually unlimited power to deny emergency unemployment compensation benefits to any applicant because under the 11th Amendment and the Younger abstention, 1, he can never be challenged for Deed's mishandling of federal programs and federal rights because that matter is limited to state proceedings whenever an appeal by an applicant is initiated. 2, neither a bankruptcy court nor a federal court have the power to hold that state accountable for their administration of the program. Now respondents maintain that what is at the heart of their refusal to grant me the rights and protections conferred on me by the 2010 Act is a legal theory that, quote, it does not apply to persons who received federal EUC benefits before its enactment, July 22, 2010. Hi, I'm Steve Carlson, and I have made this video to ask you to join a case on emergency unemployment compensation benefits, which is pending at the United States Supreme Court right now. The case number is 13-8124. It is against Mark Dayton and the Commissioner of Minnesota's Department of Employment and Economic Development. And the reason is that Minnesota has taken the position that the 2010 Unemployment Compensation Extension Act would not provide any prospective payments of the remaining entitlements you might have had from your emergency unemployment compensation benefits. That's money that hasn't been used up when that year started, and you might have been paid as little as I was, $0. My unemployment benefits, I'm the plaintiff and petitioner, have been cut off since September 2010, and right now it is April of 2014. So many of you know how important this is. I would like you to listen to this response. This is actually a reply brief which I have been asked by the Supreme Court to provide to a response which they have asked the state of Minnesota, the respondents, to provide to them. The state of Minnesota tried to waive their right to file a response, and somebody in the Supreme Court said, no, we would like to hear your response to this one. And it may well be that's because it came from the 8th Circuit that has been abusing a case called Younger versus Harris from 1971. That is a case which many states, certainly this one, have been hiding behind so that a federal government cannot ever review any kind of federal program that we have and are administering as long as they have some state proceedings which essentially block you from going to the federal court to make sure that your rights are not being violated. So that's an explanation of this. I urge you to look on the docket at 13-8124. It's called Carlson versus Deed, etc., I believe. And I would like you to, if you're a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, this is not legal advice, except perhaps to some of the judges that are involved in this. They don't usually ask for my legal advice, but I'm providing my point of view. I'm not a lawyer, so don't think that you can take the things that I say and go start a lawsuit. You'll have to read it first and make a determination whether you believe that you should get emergency unemployment benefits in a situation like this where Congress has passed a law. Congress may pass a law, and you may be in a situation where your state will deny you those benefits. It's very important. Thank you, and now I'm going to read to you from the reply brief that I'm filing. Okay, so here is my reading of my reply to the response of the state of Minnesota, Mark Dayton and Katie Sieben and the others who maladminister Minnesota's unemployment program. unemployment insurance program. Respondents focus only on the 11th Amendment, the United States Constitution, to stop injunctive or declaratory relief or damages in bankruptcy. This drove me into bankruptcy that withheld $7,000. And they do not defend their Younger position. And what that is Younger versus Harris, 401 U.S. 37 from 1971, which in my case the Eighth Circuit panel described as excluding federal jurisdiction whenever there is any supposedly parallel ongoing state civil proceeding. Quote, when Carlson filed this action on February 7th, 2012, as an adversary proceeding, neither Carlson 1 nor Carlson 2, and you'll find out what those are, they're not lawsuits. They're on two separate accounts simply telling the department to give me my federal entitlements and not pay me $0, which is what they were doing. That means they weren't paying me any dollars because they said I qualified for a state account, which is true. And I was working part-time, so they never paid me anything. So, but they say neither Carlson 1 nor Carlson 2 was finally resolved. See document number 15, affidavit of Scott A. Grosskreutz, and he is an assistant attorney general for the state of Minnesota under Lori Swanson, who has been maintaining this preposterous defense of this highly wrongful conduct against me. Then he goes on. This is quoting from the district court. Carlson does not dispute that he initiated this action in his pending bankruptcy matter prior to exhausting his state appellate remedies. Well, I dispute that there were any state appellate remedies which should have been parallel to a district court's power. Now, they do not defend their Younger position even after Sprint Communications Incorporated versus Jacobs. It's a 9-0 decision that just struck down the Eighth Circuit's idea that you could have a federal court decline jurisdiction because of something going on in a state. And this was just handed down in 2013, actually December 10th, just 6 days before I filed this petition. Because they say I don't rely on Younger. I do rely on a correct interpretation of Younger, which includes allegations that the state proceedings are in bad faith and harassment, and therefore should never have been included in the Younger exclusion doctrine. Specifically, they are completely contrived, deception, and an outright abuse of power, and unconstitutional. And I will explain that. In addition to my questions, I do say at page 12 of the petition, quote, the Younger abstention doctrine, as applied in this case, must fall, because Minnesota has no compelling interest in depriving me or others of emergency unemployment compensation payments when due, or of a deprivation of hearing. And it wasn't my case in which they struck down the Younger doctrine 9-0, an opinion written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It was a case called Sprint Communications versus Jacobs. That's what it was called by the time it got to the Supreme Court. I think in the lower courts it was called Cellular Communications, something like this. Now then we get into the position that I mentioned at the top that is being asserted by respondents at the U.S. Supreme Court. And if this was adopted, this would be extremely harmful. Respondents' current position that the Unemployment Compensation Extension Act of 2010, the Act, its coordination provisions, 26 U.S.C. 3304 note, that's part of the IRS code, I guess, extending the EUC benefits, that's emergency unemployment compensation, does not in fact extend the federal benefits to anyone who received them in the past. That, I guess, was before July 22nd, 2010, when this became effective. And I'm saying this borders on the frivolous. Now, while the act was not retrospective, it surely was intended to be prospective, covering everyone who, after this time of its passage, had remaining entitlements from their EUC benefits, Tier 1, 2, 3, going forward. Now, literally, respondents now say Congress's intent was only to allow continuing payments from a previous state benefit year where the person had qualified for emergency benefits, federal benefits, and so had remaining entitlements, but had not been paid a single dollar. What I call the coordination provisions provide for emergency unemployment compensation coordinated with state payments by preceding the state payments, where weekly payments would drop at least $100 or 25%. And many of you may have experienced this type of drop. They now admit that people who had some remaining entitlements were supposed to get first paid out of those remaining entitlements rather than just whatever state account they applied for, which, as you know, can drop drastically. But I can't figure out who they say were supposed to be paid remaining entitlements before their state account. So respondents urged the court to deny the petition because the district court found I relitigated res judicata, things that had already been determined by some unemployment law judge, and then there was some statutory summary review by the Minnesota Court of Appeals. Although the Eighth Circuit did not affirm on this ground, but they're trying to say, well, deny this petition because our state's procedures created a condition of res judicata barring any federal review of our state actions. Now, on the Eighth Circuit panel, in my questions to the court, when you file a petition, you have to identify questions that you're asking them to review. These are legal questions. They're not going to take care of you if, in fact, you've been wrongfully treated. They're not there for that purpose. That change was made in 1925 to the Supreme Court. They now just are very selective in the cases they take up. And I hope that you will support them taking up this case. Now, the per curiam of the panel, and whenever a per curiam is when somebody writes for the court. So it's basically a unanimous decision, and whoever wrote it is not always identified. So the panel's per curiam in this case touched on three matters in a de novo review of a motion for judgment on the pleadings that was filed by respondents in the state of Minnesota. First, citing Middlesex County Ethics Commission versus Garden State Bar Association from 1982 as, quote, extending the Younger versus Harris doctrine and its protection of ongoing state criminal proceedings to ongoing civil proceedings. So the way they put this case was it's just any ongoing civil proceeding, which would be your ongoing civil proceeding if you just called up your state and said, hey, why am I not getting my emergency unemployment compensation benefits? And I think that the Supreme Court, as I say in this case, has established precedents which you have to be notified and given an opportunity to be heard before you can be cut off from welfare, from employment insurance, unemployment insurance like this. So if this case became law, which I don't think it has a chance to do, it would be codified as a precedent that your state could just cut you off without pre-deprivation due process. A string of cases, starting with a case called Goldberg versus Kelly in the 70s, has established that right. And that would not be respected if this was somehow affirmed by the Supreme Court, which is not going to happen, but we still need your help. So the panel affirmed the dismissal of my bankruptcy adversary proceeding. That proceeding, which was improperly characterized as a straight civil action by the district court, was actually filed under 28 U.S.C. 157, which provides for adversary proceedings, and 1334, that's the general bankruptcy federal jurisdiction statute. And as a result, the district court characterizing my bankruptcy as a way to end run or overturn supposedly still ongoing decisions as res judicata. Magistrate Judge Keyes punished me by taking away my civil rights to access the federal courts with cases. This is not denied by respondents. The bankruptcy adversary proceedings in Ray Carlson 11-34420, taken together, triggered the striking down of my civil rights to access the federal courts. The deprivation of my civil rights should be stayed or reversed by the court. Now, since the actual deprivation of access to the courts was in two other adversary proceeding cases regarding my primary residence in bankruptcy, I had intended to pose a question for review to this court in that case, which petition must be filed in about 10 days. So that proceeding was improperly characterized as a civil proceeding by this magistrate. Now, the Younger Doctrine was also used to deny injunctive or equitable relief or declaratory relief that respondents' action violated the U.S. Constitution, which it obviously did, and they don't really contest it. Secondly, the Eighth Circuit panel makes no mention of constitutional requirements of the bankruptcy clause, which is a constitutional right, or the due process clause of the 14th Amendment or equal protection clause, but embraces only the 11th Amendment in our Constitution, recognizing no constitutional rights of EUC applicants. And three, recognizing the standard for denying injunctive relief, I asked them to turn over my money they've been holding for 3.5 years as abuse of discretion. They recognized that as the standard. The panel found no abuse of discretion and upholds the denial thereof. Now, they did not affirm the res judicata finding of the district court, and this court also should not, and should not address directly the district court's ground of res judicata to affirm the dismissal or denial as respondents urge, and should instead focus on my questions, which are compelling, important, and represent a conflict between the circuits and between the Eighth Circuit and this court's precedents, in which do set forth and fairly include res judicata as a reason to bar federal jurisdiction in questions 1 and 2. Now, respondents urge the court to ignore its recent decision on the Eighth Circuit's misapplication of the Younger Doctrine in Sprint, and also to ignore the issue of my entitlement to EUC payment and the violation of this court's constitutional requirements for the deprivation of my continuing payments of my remaining EUC entitlements complained of in my adversarial proceeding. They also argue erroneously that the district court was not exercising bankruptcy jurisdiction in my case. All of these urgings of respondents should be ignored by the court as utterly meritless. Facts. What Governor Dayton thinks. The governor, Mark Dayton, based on his submissions to the court, thinks that he and his commissioner of deed, Katie Sieben, substituted for Mark Phillips, have virtually unlimited power to deny emergency unemployment compensation benefits to any applicant because under the 11th Amendment and the Younger abstention, 1, he can never be challenged for deeds mishandling of federal programs and federal rights because that matter is limited to state proceedings whenever an appeal by an applicant is initiated. 2, neither a bankruptcy court nor a federal court have the power to hold that state accountable for their administration of the program. Now respondents maintain that what is at the heart of their refusal to grant me the rights and protections conferred on me by the 2010 Act is a legal theory that, quote, it does not apply to persons who received federal EUC benefits before its enactment, July 22, 2010, unquote, as I've already described. Now here's what the law actually says. Under this court's precedents, and those include Goldberg versus Kelly from 1970, the United States Supreme Court, all these are United States Supreme Court cases, Sneadock versus Family Finance Corporation from 1969, Sherbert versus Verner, that's 374 U.S. 398 from 1963, Nash versus Florida Industrial Commission, that's 389 U.S. 235 from 1967, and also California Department of Human Resources versus Java, 402 U.S. 121 from 1971 regarding 42 U.S.C. 503A1 and also 503A. Those require that any state that is going to be credited with payments for the with payments for the unemployment insurance program have got to have a system of administration that's calculated to make payments to recipients when due. And that has not been done in this case, and the state is concerned about that. I think that they could fix this. They say this has affected thousands of other Minnesotans just like it's affected me. But I doubt that, but that's what they claim. The respondents must comply with federal law. The administration of the unemployment insurance benefits program must be carried out in a way which will pay recipients when due, as I've said, and deprivation of unemployment benefits, including EUC remaining entitlements when due, must be preceded by pre-deprivation due process, including notice and opportunity to be heard. This is what the law actually says, not what Mark Dayton thinks. Now, a state official violating federal law can be held accountable under the 11th Amendment and this court's precedents. And I discuss here the case they've raised, Pennhurst State School and Hospital versus Haldeman. This is from 1984, 465 United States Supreme Court 89, noting that sovereign immunity extends to agencies. But in that case, they cite Ex parte Young from 1908. And in that case, it recognized an important exception to the general rule of protection against federal review, that a suit challenging a federal constitutionality of a state official's action is not one against the state, and therefore it's not protected by the 11th Amendment. And also for damages. Now this has been raised in my petition. And the state official can be enjoined in bankruptcy, adversarial proceedings such as this one, to turn over and account for money withheld. This is what the law actually says. Younger abstention has now been limited by Sprint to equitable injunction of ongoing criminal cases and 3 more narrow categories and no further. Categories identified in New Orleans Public Service Incorporated versus Council of City of New Orleans. It's also called NOPSI. That's 491 U.S. 350 from 1989, and that was upheld in the Sprint case. And the state proceedings at issue in this case, or in your case, if they do this to you, do not fall within those categories.